So we have 25 minutes or so for discussion, questions. You have an incredibly well-qualified audience out there. I've seen the list of who you all are. We've got people who are involved in campaigns. We've got people who are academics. We've got members of the public with particular interests. So Humza's opened his part of the contribution up for initial debate. So if there are any things people particularly want to ask Humza, now is a good time to do it. But if you want to ask a question to all three of our speakers at the same time, equally feel free to do that. And given we are being recorded, it'd be very helpful if people just give us their name. And if you're representing a group or you want to say where you're from, that would be good as well. And then we can capture it in terms of the report from tonight's meeting. So the floor is yours. Who would like to kick off? And as ever, stick your hand up in the air, and I'll take the first person on the right, who's a member of the Cross-Party Group in International Development, but if you'd like to introduce yourself as well. Yeah, if people can be bothered, then it's easier to record people's comments, I think.
Yeah. David Stevenson, just to pick up the point about slavery, a lot of people don't realise how late it continued. Now, in my 20s, I met in what is now Malawi a man in his 90s, Petro Kadekwa, who had been captured and sold as a slave at about the age of 8. And he was released at Zanzibar by a British warship and was educated there and became an Anglican priest in Africa. So it's not all that long ago. People tend to believe that the slave trade was abolished well, very distantly in the past. I just want to amplify that point.
Okay, next man in tweed, right up. My name is Wolfgang Zeller. I work at the Centre of African Studies at the University of Edinburgh. And one of the things I do there is I teach a course titled Governing Mineral Extraction in Africa. And I see several of the students I've taught last semester there, actually in the audience. I've noticed over the years of teaching this course that one of the hottest topics among all the hot topics we tend to talk about and discuss, one that really gets the students going is the session where we talk about financial secrecy. And this topic, interestingly, came up in various ways, especially in your presentation, Claude, but also in other parts. And so this is one of the topics which seems to be very timely because a lot of people talk about financial secrecy as harming UK society, the way that companies can evade taxation. And it is certainly something we can observe as very harmful for African societies. And there's real potential, I think, for corporate practice to be reined in by establishing procedures that are not just kind of saying business is bad, but saying we need to get more out of business. So having said that, it seems to me that this is a topic that has a lot of kind of way to go that could be brought forward in terms of policy, where something could be done that looks good and can actually have an effect. I'm quite interested to see what the Scottish, or to hear what the Scottish government, be it independent or be it part of the UK in the long run, intends to do in terms of pushing that agenda, if it is pushing it. Thank you.
And anyone else want to ask a question before I go back to our speakers? No, in that case.
Sure. Thank you for the reminder from David about slavery not being that perhaps not so far back in our history as we think. In terms of the last point, I think it's a great point to raise. And let me be fair to the UK government in that it's an issue that I think in the last couple of years they've started to take seriously on their agenda. They got great credit for raising it on various international stages, be it in the European Union, but more so in G20 and G8, but G20. And what we've done in the white paper, we've really nailed our colours to the mast in this one and really made this an important agenda for us, the issue of tax avoidance. Because, again, it's really an issue of priorities. For every time a government minister will tell you that there's no money and therefore they have to make cuts to welfare, but then £25 billion legally escapes. That's what we know of, illegal tax loopholes. Then there's an injustice. So it's an issue, again, of justice. So we've said very, very clearly that, yes, in the white paper, it's also detailed Chapter 3. I should really remember the page number, it's terrible. But Chapter 3 in the white paper, we talk about the financial regulations that we would bring forward. And already having those discussions with the UK government in terms of what we would do in terms of tax avoidance. But, there's I couldn't say to you overnight if people of Scotland vote for independence that we'll have all the legal tax loopholes closed. It's forever a battle that you're fighting, but it's one that we'd be very keen to promote on the agenda, but particularly in the European Union, because it's going to take collective action. It's not going to be the actions of one individual country, regardless of how small or big that country is. It's going to need really Europe to take that seriously. In that respect, I applaud the efforts that are being made incrementally by the UK government. But yeah, certainly it's mentioned in the white paper upon independence.
A couple of points. I think that David Stevenson is completely wrong about slavery. It is much more current than you're suggesting. In fact, I don't think it's ever gone away. I mean, the person you were talking about was, 80 or 90 years old now. I mean, there are people today in Ivory Coast who are effectively slaves. They are children, but I'm not even who are working in the cocoa plantations. But I'm not even talking about them. I'm talking about actual chattel slavery, the sale of and ownership of one person by another, and that is going on today in places like Mauritania. So it is even more current, David, than I think that than you were suggesting, which is a tragedy. On the question of financial secrecy, I think, Paul, you're absolutely right. It is a major issue, and one of the issues is also that you're dealing with companies which are not necessarily registered in this country, even though they have major interests that are operating here. And let me bring one specific example. There is a company which has its registration or operation from Tanzania called Soma Oil, but it uses Michael Howard, the former Conservative Party leader, and he has recently been working in investments in Somalia, extremely questionable. I'm sure that he thinks that they are fine, and I'm sure the company says that it's doing no wrong. But these are extremely questionable, investing in a war zone. And even worse, he's recently been gone to Eritrea. In Eritrea, the gold and the copper mining is done by members of national service. There is forced conscription for at least 7 years, some people for even longer. And frankly, for a senior British Conservative member to be involved in a company which is even thinking about operating in the most repressive state in Africa. There is no democracy in Eritrea of any description whatsoever, not one independent newspaper, not one independent member of parliament. And for him to be going around and making these kind of links in a war zone and in a country like that, I think is really open to question. So absolutely, financial secrecy is a problem, but there's also the operation of companies which have links with this country but don't actually reside in this country, and I think that's another issue that has to be looked at. Finally, I wonder if I may just ask you one question. It's recently been said that one of the big issues is about aid transparency. Everyone's in favour of aid, but do you publish where you spend that aid? Because there's been a lot of criticism of, for example, the British, not the Scottish aid system, that some of the money, yes, they give the money. Everyone knows that it goes, say that £20 million is given to Malawi, for argument's sake. But how much of that, where is it actually spent? And if you were a villager somewhere, would you be able to trace back the money that is supposed to have come through to build a pump, but actually it's never arrived? It's ended up in the pocket of the governor of that province or something like that. And one of the big questions now is, are you prepared to publish exactly so that somebody, shall we say, perhaps through an aid agency, at least can be assisted in saying, why has the money's been given to you to build the pump, why is it not there?
Yeah, just on that, I mean, it's a really good point. The first thing to say about Scottish Government's International Development Programme, because international development is still very much reserved to London, we effectively we can get away with it because of caveat that we exploit in the Scotland Act, but so long as we don't ask the UK government for any money for it, essentially. And we don't give any government-to-government funding, so we don't do that. So we don't give the money that is spent in Malawi and Zambia, Rwanda, Tanzania, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India. None of that is given to the government. That's not to say, of course, if there was independence, that might not change. So we don't necessarily have the same issue because all of it is distributed via NGOs, and all the NGOs produce interim and end-of-year reports, which are then published, and people can trace back where money, and hence why Scottish Government officials end up, and ministers go out on a regular basis to view some of those projects and so on. So there is a level of transparency that is, if I'm being frank, but easier to manage with a modest international development budget. You're absolutely correct to say that the challenge really begins if the people of Scotland vote yes in the referendum, and the budget goes from 9 million, where it currently is, to somewhere closer to probably approximately 900 million to $1 billion. That's where, and in parts of the African continent where we already work and have links, we will be, in some cases, maybe possibly even the largest aid donor, if not some of the largest aid donors. And therefore, you're absolutely right, transparency. And this is where I think we have a great advantage if we do become independent, is you can very clearly learn from the best and make sure you avoid the mistakes of the best. But having said that, I think DFID are certainly improving in that matter, and I have a huge amount of respect for the work that they do and that they're trying to do in terms of aid transparency.
Yeah, just before I bring Claude in, an interesting add-on to that answer by Humza. When we had our last Scottish Parliament visit to Malawi, which coincided with Joyce Banda's visit here, we were having discussions with the Finance Committee in the Malawi Parliament. And one of the challenges when you go to one of the African states, when we're thinking about development and accountability, is explaining who we are. So we actually happen to have 2 opposition MSPs visiting Malawi. And they wanted to ask us what kind of transparency they could have on our programme in Malawi. And it was one of the things we fed back to Humza, that they wanted to scrutinise how we were spending our money in Malawi, and more than that, how we set our priorities for what the Scottish Government set in Malawi. So that whole process is actually quite important. I think a lot of our work as a Parliament has been helping democracy and saying that it's not just a government-to-government relationship, which is great when you're in government, having been in government in the past, but there's also an issue about holding governments to account and then swapping notes. And that process, I think, is something that Scotland has been very keen to do, that whole transparency issue. So trying to at least do it within our own competence and trying to be best practice there. Now, are you going to have to go at this point? Yes. Can I ask everyone to thank Humza for coming along and engaging in the discussion tonight? It's been very useful. Thank you, Humza. We're now doing a bit of swapping of cards so that people can keep in touch afterwards.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah.
Which is always one of the opportunities that we all have of networking and making sure that the good issues that are raised don't get lost. We had 2 questions earlier on, and I want to pass across to Claude. You had a perspective you wanted to get in.
Yes, I think illicit financial flows, we need to understand the mechanisms, how it happens. It happens in different ways. And the first one is tax evasion, where companies simply put up mechanisms to evade tax. And sometimes they do it in collusion with government. But there is also tax avoidance and undervalue of commodities, where most of our government states are very weak, got no capacity to monitor how much companies are extracting and how much they are exporting. And most of the time, we've realized that companies undervalue both quantity and quality. And Africa is losing billion. And I'm happy that Thabo Mbeki will come because he's leading a panel on illicit financial flows. In fact, Africa does not need aid if money from extractive industry is properly captured. And that's the challenge. There is also negotiation of mining contract. which most of the time, because of the need for African government to attract foreign direct investment, they are ready to negotiate a contract that give companies more benefits than countries, sometimes through devious negotiations, which involves a lot of corruption. But also, when you look at most of our countries, there's a vibrant artisanal mining. And the fact that a formal company, big corporation can buy from artisanal mining, they underpay those artisanal mining and overprice the same minerals at the international market. Africa continues to lose in all these scenarios. So I think it's an important. I know the G20 group, they are talking about how do we fund mechanisms to limit illicit financial flows. But to do that, there is much work to be done, not just on the receiving on the African side, but also where the commodities are consumed. And this is exactly here. When you look at the ENRC, which delisted from the London Stock Exchange just last year, having listed in 1997, in 2007, and the pressure that was put on that company. Now that the company is delisted, it has gone underground. In a country like Congo, it will be very difficult to control NSA. But opposite to that, you've got Glencore, which behave in the same manner than many other companies, but which does not receive sufficient pressure to ensure that it's transparent and accountable. And that's the challenge we have to when we look at the financial structure. For example, in London, that will put pressure. And when you look at the key stakeholder in Glencore and in ENRC, is the same person. But pressure is put on one particular company and not on the other one. But if you scratch underneath, then you find that there is complicity, even at that level of the London Stock Exchange. And that poses a serious problem and challenge for African government, which do not have the capacity to monitor and to follow up on these transactions.
That puts more of an emphasis on us and what we can potentially do in terms of finding out those facts. Yep. Did you want to come in and ask a question?
I'm happy to.
Yep. I don't have a forest of hands, and we do have time before the reception starts. And we're probably not going to get two more qualified speakers to be able to talk to us about this topic for a long time. So it's definitely an opportunity not to be missed.
Otherwise, I can ask
and
my
that
question and you can think
that
about
has provoked a question, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Good.
If you want to come up and give us your name and organisation.
My name is Ashkan. I am one of the past disciples of Dr. Zeller. My question mainly concerns the neoliberal trend. The currency has been put out of the government's hands, so wealth distribution is no longer in the state's hands. There is a rapid and growing capital mobility on the agenda and the rise of transnationalism. Now, given in this context, do you think Africa has the time to catch up with the rest of the world? And I know, Africa is pretty general, but the African countries, do they have the time to catch up with the rest of the world? And is there an African version of modernity that's emerging in recent days? Thank you.
Right at the front there, yeah, missed you.
Hi, I'm Jenny Munro, and I just wanted to ask a question to both, actually. It was mentioned in the passing that the relationship with Europe is very strong and that that's something that China lacks, basically. But if we look at the current situation in many African countries, that China has bought lots of land with minerals on them and has invested, through companies, in minerals and basically the resources that Africa has, there will be a relationship with China. Do you think that, so we have a very strong past with Britain, but the question is, where is the future lying? And do you think that the British relation, or the relationship between Britain and Africa can actually help the Chinese African relationship in that sense? Or is the lack of communication with China on the level that Britain and Africa have, is that actually a problem? Thanks.
It was initially a question for Humza, but it could as well be a question for you, Sarah, and other MSPs here. It's about to go back to the fair trade issue and what can be done. So when I moved to Scotland, it was just a year ago, I was very impressed by the label Fair Trade Nation. I hadn't heard about such thing before, actually, and then I tried to understand what it is about. And then I even talked to colleagues at my university, such as Liz Cooper, who is responsible for the fair trade issues at Edinburgh University. And what I understood it was very much about encouraging people to buy more products and also have procurement using more fair traded products with a fair trade label. And then I came across an initiative, a very interesting one, by students at St Andrews University, and they're actually here in the room. It's conflict-free St Andrews. What they, as far as I remember, what they tried to do got to do actually at St Andrews University is to get them to adjust their procurement requirements to make sure that where they source their computers, their electronics, their iPads from, that sourcing will be conflict-free. I was just interested in whether this is on your agenda, whether this is something where Scotland could, the UK, could do some more. Thank you. My name's Jana Hunken.
Right, 3 very good questions. We're going to ask Martin to come in first this time.
Very difficult questions. On the neoliberalism one, I mean, I'm somewhat torn about the problem of neoliberalism because, on the one hand, what went before neoliberalism, in a sense, was were forms of regulation by the state, which in some ways were even worse. I mean, you had an even more corrupt state, even more empowered and capable of being more extractive than you do under a neoliberal regime, where you are, in a sense, at least in theory, are going to open up all these markets. So, I mean, it is a very complicated. I don't think it's a simple yes or no answer to neoliberalism. But let me give you one example of the way in which the trend in Africa has moved in recent years. And I think it's an extremely worrying one. I don't know if you know, but at the end of apartheid, many of the companies that had been domiciled in South Africa, like Old Mutual, SAB, Miller, and Anglo-American, moved out of South Africa and took their headquarters to London. This actually exported a lot of the capital that South Africa had built up over many, many, many years. Now, there were benefits to South Africa because it gave them a much wider. I mean, they were still had links to South Africa, but had a much wider global relationship. But what has happened now is, and you see it in the country. I mean, South Africa's been mining minerals for more than 100 years now, and a lot of those mines are now practically at the end of their life. What happens is that they get moved out of the Anglo-American stable and out of the big boys down to smaller and smaller players. Finally, I mean, I went to see one called Aurora Mining. 2 major mines, which had been taken over by Kulubusa Zuma and Zondwa Mandela, and those names were not coincidental. And they took them over. For 18 months, they paid their miners nothing. Absolutely zero so far worse than any exploitative multinational. And some miners committed suicide. And when this was brought, when the company was brought before the South African Parliament, Kulubusi Zuma made a R1 million donation to the ANC local election fund, and amazingly, that investigation has disappeared. So there is a real problem that you have two things happening there: the headquarters moving out of Africa, taking with them expertise and capital, and then a gradual, shall we say, reduction in the size of the company that's involved and its relationship to the mine and to the mining operation. And there's one final, and this is my last point, and I'm sorry, I don't need to take too much time. There is a terrible legacy in South Africa, which is called acid mine drainage. I don't know how many of you have ever heard of this, but the actual water table in South Africa is rising, and it is rising through because they've penetrated some of the levels. There's no more pumping going on in these mines. It is coming up at about 3 or 4 meters a day. Now, these are very, very deep mines, so it's taking a long time. They're reaching critical levels now. In some places, you can go from Johannesburg, and I'm sure you're aware of this, where you can see cakes of yellow silt. This is highly dangerous. It contains many, many terrible toxins, including uranium, I think it's sulfuric acid, and God knows what else. People are living on top of those now, and there is a real danger that South Africa is going to be left with this in perpetuity. In the budget that was launched this week, the government now put a tax on to try and deal with this issue. It is almost impossible to deal with and threatens the entire region's water supplies. This is a real present problem, the result of 100 years of mining, much of that with the profits having come back to this country. Who ends up with the problem? Africa. It's a tragedy.
I think Andrew's example on South Africa just tells us, because the companies that extracted the gold, they're all disappeared. And it's the government that is sitting with the problem. And it's the poor citizens, South African, who have to pay the bill to fix that problem. So for me, the issue of neoliberalism starts to speak to the issue of the question of less state and more market. And that discourse is quite problematic in the context of the African continent today. Because you've got companies which are very powerful. Too powerful that they can impose their will on certain government. And in certain cases, even impose regime change. And to protect their regime, some of these leaders, they go with the wind of and the mind and what these companies want. So what I'm saying, I think, what we need is more of a developmental state. In a state that is very responsible, a state that is. You take South Korea with which car? Which car is that? They've started producing a car. I'm not very good with cars.
Terrible with cars.
It's not a. Is it Hyundai? Hyundai? Is it?
Hyundai.
Yeah. You know what they've done? For Hyundai to be what it is today is because the state intervened and invested quite a lot of money to ensure that it becomes a very strong international mark. So I'm just saying it's possible for the African state to play a role, an interventionist role, to ensure that they protect some of their industries. And you'll know that today the challenge we have is that the industrialization of the African continent has become quite difficult because of how do you catch up? How do you compete with what exists already? And even in the case where certain countries want to put up export tax on minerals to push companies to start transforming minerals locally, companies are refusing that they are not in the business of transforming minerals, but of digging and exporting minerals. So it's a challenge. How do you, because we think that the question of unemployment, we can only resolve it with industrialization. And that industrialization at the current stage has to pass through the extraction of the transformation of our minerals. So it's going to create downstream and upstream industries. It's the only way we can deal with the question of unemployment today. But we also have to know that extractive industries are a comparative advantage. But agriculture is our competitive advantage. And we think that Africans have to change the way they think about development and start to look into diversifying the economic activities and coming back to agriculture, which is a very important and huge sector which can absorb some of this unemployment, but also feed, because the challenge we have is also how to feed the population. So I think Africa can catch up with the rest of the world. If China has done it, Africa can also do it. And you know, the only continent with the biggest challenge of development is Africa. And I think the only time Africa can catch up is when Africa starts to consume its own minerals. Because it's the continent with problems of development. And unless we consume those minerals, and for us to consume them, we have to transform them. And we have to do it on the continent. And we need to ensure that there is a linkage between local and... we break that enclave, those enclave economy. About China, really very quickly. Sorry, I think it's I say China is there is an assumption today that China has got better relationship with Africa than Europe has. And the point I'm making is that if we go into the historical relationship we have with Europe, as negative as it has been, Europe has got an advantage to rectify the past and build on that past to create a far much closer relationship with Africa than China can pretend to have. But China is taking over because Europe does not want to rectify.
Do you want to come in? Quick question? Because I'm going to answer Jana's question after you, and then I'm going to close up.
I thought there were some more answers to come. Thanks very much. I'm Sarah Dorman from the University of Edinburgh. Claude, I want to pick up on that very interesting connection you made, because what I'm struck by, and based on research by colleagues of mine elsewhere, is that when we look at the Asian developmental states and their progress, it's not been through the industrialization and Hyundai and so forth. It's been that's really been the key to their success. That's important, but it's actually been their attention to agriculture and to smallholder agriculture, and that is where African governments, as Martin referred to, from before independence and from since independence, have completely failed to properly support, to provide infrastructure, to provide any sort of expertise to smallholder agricultures. And we can go regimes from left to right and from east to west, and it's been true across the entire continent. So how do we actually get African governments to take agriculture seriously if it is the solution to industrializing, to sustainable growth, and to helping Africa to catch up with the other countries?
That's a good question, and I'm smiling because that was the topic of our last cross-party group in international development in this very building, and we had Agnes giving us the views of the diaspora in Britain as to how they use their muscle politically here to have those kind of discussions and to raise those agendas. But before we finish, I'm going to let Maureen Watt come in. She is the convener of the cross-party group on Malawi.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Yeah, I'm convener of the cross-party group in Malawi. Just like to pick up the point about China. I think the relationship with China could probably grow faster and be more important in Africa. I mean, in Malawi, for example, the parliament was built by the Chinese with seemingly no strings attached, really, but I'm sure there's going to be a payback at some point. And, I think the problem that Europe, and particularly I think the UK, has, that by its very nature, any aid that we give has got to be open and transparent and traceable, and that takes time, whereas the Chinese can go in, throw money at something, and they're accountable to nobody. So there is a balance, I think, to be struck on that. The other thing that I thought would be worth highlighting is, two things since the last question, is the oil and gas finds in East Africa. And Humza mentioned Joyce Banda's visit, and on the back of that, through Scottish Development International, have been a number of oil and gas companies go to East African companies that have discovered oil and gas. So I think it's important and interesting that the kind of government is leading these missions to help in those countries. Obviously, the companies are going out there, obviously looking for work, but it is being done through Scottish Development International. And, for example, Mozambique has discovered gas, and the president of Mozambique chose to come to Scotland to learn about gas extraction. I'm an Aberdeen MSP, and they met with, obviously companies locally, but they also met with the universities, and immediately Robert Gordon University in my constituency offered 8 postgraduate posts, either in business management or oil and gas related areas. So it's building these links so that you can help, and in that way perhaps the companies will be monitored and looked at much more closely and not allowed such exploitation as we've heard tonight. Interestingly, the international development last cross-party group was about agriculture. Our last cross-party group in Malawi was about an organisation called GalvMed, which is sponsored by the Gates Foundation, and that's about making sure that medicines are available for cattle against East African fever. And we know that through Scottish Agricultural College and I think at University of Edinburgh, for example, they give dairy farmers apps so that they know when to treat mastitis and put the cows to the bull and things like that. So there's lots of work going on in our relationships. Sorry.
No, that's great. I was told that we had to finish at 7:15, then 7:20, and we're definitely on for 7:30. And I need to answer the question that was asked about fair trade. I mean, in a sense, for me, fair trade is an activist campaign that lets us change the world in a positive way in terms of trade. And when I think back to my student days, it was about disinvestment in apartheid South Africa, and that's what got us excited. For a lot of the students in Edinburgh University about 7 years ago, the prospect of the millions upon millions of pounds that they spent every year in coffee being spent to fairly traded companies that would then have a benefit in sub-Saharan African countries was a really exciting and a very positive thing for them to do. And certainly from our perspective in the Parliament, the fact that we're a fair trade nation isn't just the title, it's all the huge civic engagement that goes with that and the awareness raising. I discovered the other week my 8-year-old nephew is the fair trade monitor in his primary class, and it's like, my God, do they do that at primary school? And actually we do that at primary school, and it's about awareness raising. And IT connections are enabling knowledge in a way that we just didn't have in my generation. So it is partly about educating the next generation to ask the right questions, but it's also a solidarity and an equity issue. So this year, fair trade happens to be Nepalese paper makers, as it turns out. But in the past, we've had African nut producers, coffee producers, sugar producers. And the last parliamentary visit we had to Malawi, to get to go and visit the sugar cooperative that had been involved in one of the fair trade fortnights and actually see the investment they were able to make in training and in education and in health projects in their village was incredibly empowering and actually really exciting to then come back and feed that information back to people that are involved in fair trade in terms of the consumer purchase opportunities. So I think it's not just a question of campaigning against bad things or shedding light on tax evasion or companies, and certainly we'll definitely want to pick up that South African example, because we've touched on all sorts of other environmental issues in the cross-party group in international development. But maybe with South Africa, when Nelson Mandela was elected, the thought was job done. It's quite difficult to go back and then say, no, Nirvana wasn't created overnight and there's lots of problems. So maybe that's a critical friend relationship that we have a right to have as people who supported the struggle in South Africa. So lots of food for thought there, but for me, Fair Trade Nation is about all the different communities and all of us as individuals finding that power as consumers to actually really make a difference. We are having to wind up. Would either of our speakers like a very brief comment back? I think you wanted a quick comment, Martin, because we need to move to Jana, who's going to then wind us all up.
Very, very briefly. Two, I think, good news items. The one is that I mentioned the International Criminal Court and how important it was in bringing justice to Africa, but it's equally true that there have been people like Lee Day who have begun to bring justice through British courts. You probably know about their work in Kenya in exposing the torture of Mau Mau victims. I'm happy to say that they are now taking on Shell UK in the Niger Delta. It's going to be a long battle, but they are determined to do it. They already brought a case against Trafigura, a massive company based in Holland, and about what it did in Ivory Coast, or as it says it didn't do. But if I may make a plea to you, there is something you can do, and it relates to what you did in South Africa. The moment that South Africa trembled was when you went for the pension funds. It was the New York State Teachers Pension Fund decision to no longer invest in South Africa. That was the moment when the South African government said, whoa, now we've got to negotiate. It's impossible. Because they knew their access to funds was gone. Now, in this room, there's huge expertise. If you choose your companies carefully and you begin to mobilize your pension fund money around what you believe to be the most important mining extractive industry issues, and you mobilize those pension funds to begin to withdraw funds from those companies, that's the moment you will see change.
And maybe to answer Sarah's point, look, the decimation of agriculture on the African continent was caused by many factors. The key one was bad policy internally by African government. But let's not forget the structure adjustment program, which really contributed to that. But I think then there is, at the continental level, at the AU level, Africa is talking about improving agriculture. At regional bodies, they've forced government to increase their investment in agriculture. And we've seen countries really, Malawi, for example, Zambia, agriculture picking up. So I think we are in the right direction, but more focus is needed. I think China is an opportunity for Africa, contrary to people who think that is not good. China is an opportunity because it provides Africa with multiple choice to choose from who should invest and make deals. But Africa is not using that opportunity properly. And that's the problem. The problem is not China. The problem is Africa that is not using that as an opportunity.
Well, look, that's a great point to end on. I think the message from the top table tonight is you pick your campaign, but make sure you do something, whether it's your pension fund, working with your trade union to talk about health and safety rights on the ground in companies, or getting in touch with your political representatives, or publishing that research paper that exposes what's going on. I hope everybody in the room takes something out of tonight and makes a personal commitment that you will not let the agenda rest that we've heard about tonight, and that you will do your bit in thinking about the corporate social responsibilities of the companies that we have in our country and the investments they have abroad. And there's power in us doing that together. And the last point is we have a European election, which is always seen as the most boring elections. But that's where all the EU trade decisions are taken, and they impact on billions, and they are the ones that impact on a lot of the African trade issues. So let's bring a bit of light and a bit of heat to some of those issues. Can I thank our two speakers tonight who have been absolutely fantastic, in the usual manner with a round of applause, and then we'll hand over to Jana to wind up. Thank you very much.